Welcome to the Real News Network in Baltimore. I'm Kim Brown. A new report has just been released on changing attitudes of Canadians towards Israel-Palestine. The report, which is entitled Canadians' Views of the Israeli Government versus Canadian Government Policy Towards Israel and Palestine, echoes the results of previous Canadian surveys over the past 5 years. It reflects a clear rising sympathy for Palestinians and declining sympathy for the State of Israel. They also expose a growing and sharp divide between those who identify as pro-Palestinian as opposed to pro-Israeli views. It is also apparently the published survey that examines whether Canadians consider criticism of the Israeli government to be anti-Semitic. And joining us today to discuss the report and its implications is Earl A. Washburn. Earl is a senior analyst at Ecos Research Associates and played a crucial role in guiding and designing and analyzing the survey behind the report. And we're also joined today with Dimitri Lascaris. Dimitri is a lawyer, journalist, and activist. He's also a board member here at The Real News. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Dimitri, let's start off with you and why was the survey conducted, rather, and what did you discover?
Well, first of all, I'm a part of a small coalition that came together to sponsor this survey, to ask Ecos to perform this survey. The other members of the coalition are a journalist and social activist by the name of Murray Dobbin, an organization called Independent Jewish Voices Canada, and another organization called Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. All of us have been active in trying to educate the Canadian public about violations of Palestinian human rights, because frankly, the mainstream media did not do a particularly good job of keeping the public informed on that issue. And we were, quite cognizant of the fact, and have been for quite some time, that the government of Canada has historically had a position of unqualified support for the government of Israel. And in the course of our work in trying to educate the public about the situation in the occupied territories, we came to believe that there was a very significant degree and growing degree of sympathy amongst Canadians that was not consistent with the unqualified support for the government of Israel that the Canadian government has been showing over the last several decades. And we wanted to test that and see whether, in fact, a scientifically, validly robust survey would bear out that, in fact, there is a growing level of sympathy for the Palestinian people, a growing recognition that the government of Israel is consistently violating their rights. So that's what ultimately brought us together to commission this survey.
So, Dimitri, what were the questions and the subject matters that were put into this survey, put to those people who were questioned?
Well, the first one is we asked people whether they had a positive or negative view of the Israeli government. And I just want to preface this by saying, for those who aren't from Canada or who know Canada's political systems, there are basically 5 parties in our parliament. There's the Conservative Party, which is a right-wing party, the Liberal Party, which has currently got a majority government, and they are center to center right. Then you have the NDP, traditionally a social democratic party, the Green Party, the party of which I am a member, and the Bloc Québécois, which is confined to Quebec and is a separatist party. So with that as background, we asked people about which party they support and how they viewed the government of Israel. And the numbers were quite striking when you compare it to government policy in Canada. 46% of those who expressed an opinion, 46% of Canadians had a negative view of the Israeli government, and only 28% had a positive view. And when you broke that down by party support, it was really striking. The Conservative supporters were way out on the fringe. 58% of them said they had a positive view, but 55 to 78% of the supporters of the other parties said that they had a negative view, and only 5 to 22% of the supporters of the other parties said they had a positive view of the government of Israel. Interestingly, the negativity increased the younger the respondent, and also the higher the education level of the respondent, the more they tended to view the government of Israel negatively. So we also asked them we asked respondents whether or not they thought the government of Canada was pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian, and far more Canadians believe, according to the survey, that the Canadian government is pro-Israel. 61% then is pro-Palestinian, only 16% believe that. And again, that number rises considerably amongst supporters for the center-right, and left-leaning parties. The Conservatives are kind of out on the margins on that issue. On the question, we asked people about media bias. Do they think the Canadian media is biased? And 45% didn't think that they were biased one way or the other. More of the Liberal NDP bloc and Green respondents tended to view the media as pro-Israel, ranging from 36 to 43%. Only 8 to 11% of those groups thought it was pro-Palestinian. And then finally, and I think this may be the most striking result of the survey, we asked people whether criticism of the Israeli government was anti-Semitic. And overall, 91% of respondents accepted the view that the criticism of the Israeli government is not necessarily anti-Semitic. For a couple of the parties, supporters of the NDP and the Bloc Québécois, I believe, 100% said it was not necessarily anti-Semitic. Even in the Conservative Party, the supporters of the Conservative Party, 80% of those respondents said it was not necessarily anti-Semitic. And there are a whole bunch of reasons why this has very significant implications for government policy. One of them is that the Parliament, specifically the Conservative and the governing Liberal Party, within the last year, adopted a motion condemning quite stridently the movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And although that motion, that resolution, didn't specifically say that supporters of the BDS movement are anti-Semitic, the debates in Parliament clearly contained allegations to that effect. And also in Canada's most populous province, Ontario, the legislature, the provincial legislature, a little later, adopted a similar resolution. And again, it doesn't specifically say that the support for BDS is anti-Semitic, but in the debates there was there were a lot of assertions to that effect. And even one MP, a Conservative MPP in the Ontario legislature, went so far as to compare the BDS movement to the Ku Klux Klan. It's really remarkable and shameful, really, when one considers what's being done to the Palestinian people. So how does one reconcile the overwhelming public opinion that criticism of the Israeli government is not necessarily anti-Semitic with these allegations being made by the political class in the Ontario legislature and amongst the Liberals and the Conservatives in the federal Parliament, that to the effect that people who support the BDS movement, which is a peaceful call for economic sanctions on Israel, for them to say that the supporters of this movement are anti-Semitic is simply profoundly inconsistent with public opinion.
So, Earl, the report is based on a survey of 1,000 Canadians. So to what extent can this be said to be a statistically sufficient representation of the Canadian population as a whole?
Sure. Basically, how we did this survey is we have a panel, an online panel. It's an online phone hybrid panel that we use to survey the Canadian population. This particular survey was conducted using our online panel, but 80-90% of Canadians have access to the internet. So we find that being able to survey members of the panel, members of our panel that are online, we think is a very statistically significant population that we're able to pull. So we do have good confidence in this particular survey. We weighted the data by gender, by age, by education, and by region to make sure that all of the distribution of the sample is as close to as possible the natural population of Canada based on the 2011 census, which is the last census that we have the information on the gender and age and the population of the country based on those parameters and education as well. So based on our statistical methods, we find that the survey results are definitely representative of the Canadian population. Our particular panel, compared to other online panels that are used by other companies in the country, is not an opt-in panel. That means that we can use statistical weighting. We can use statistical reporting on it using things like margin of error, which is not supposed to be used for other online panels because other online panels are what they call opt-in panels, where you can just sign up on their websites and to join their panels. But what we do is we randomly recruit members of our panel by using phone people across the country asking them to join the panel. And that way they're randomly recruited, and we feel that based on that method, our panel, doing surveys with our particular panel, our online panel, is statistically significant. And we can use proper statistical measurements on it, such as the margin of error.
So, Earl, what, if anything, surprised you the most about what you discovered?
Well, I can't really speak too much into the breakdowns and that kind of thing. But I did find this particular topic to be quite interesting. I think Dimitri mentioned how the partisan breakdown is quite interesting. In my opinion, my background is in political science, so it was interesting to see the particular divide between the conservatives and the non-conservative parties in the country, and the support of those parties, the supporters of those parties, and how they broke down on the various questions. I found very fascinating.
Well, let me ask you this, phrase it in a different way. Earl, who was more likely to actually respond to the survey? Like which demographic, which party member, which region of Canada?
Sure. The way we work with these particular surveys is we stratify the sample based on responses to previous surveys that we do for other clients, of course. So there's certain demographics that are more likely to respond to surveys just based on historical precedent. Older people tend to do more surveys, things like that. And so going into when we sample for this particular survey, for surveys in general, we make sure that people who are less likely to do surveys, we would sample more of those people, so they have more of them are able to do the survey if they want to, and with the end goal of having a distribution that mirrors the Canadian population. So yeah, this particular survey, is generally quite balanced in terms of age, gender, and region, because that was our intention going in. We stratified the sample to make sure that the results, the demographic breakdown of the results, matched the Canadian population.
So, Dimitri, your report found that higher sympathy for Palestinians tends to occur among supporters of the Liberal, NDP, Green, and Black Quebecois parties. So people under 35 also expressed higher sympathy for Palestinians, people who are higher educated as well, people from Quebec, visible minorities, and non-religious people. So why do you suppose that is? Why do these demographics tend to view the Palestinian and the Palestinian plight in more of a sympathetic way?
One reason for the higher levels of support amongst younger persons is that, for a long time, there was a certain narrative about the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis that the mainstream media had really very much repeated over and over again, and had become firmly entrenched in Canadian political thinking. But, younger voters tend, in my experience, to rely more upon independent media, online sources of information, which are revealing to them information about the conflict that is not necessarily available to them, in, for example, Post Media, the largest newspaper publisher in Canada, which is a very, very stridently pro-Israel editorial perspective. So they're getting their information from somewhat different sources, which are giving them better insight into what is going on. I think that's also true of, people who are higher educated. They tend to have a better understanding of what is going on, and that's reflected in the levels of sympathy. Ultimately, these parties, and I want to really sort of focus on the Liberal Party because that's the current governing party, and it's a party that likes to promote itself as being progressive, even though the substantive policies of the party, I think, can fairly be described as center-right. That party came to power most recently in late 2015. Of course, our viewers will know, Real News viewers will know, the Prime Minister is Justin Trudeau, who just came to Washington to visit with President Trump. In less than 18 months, Prime Minister Trudeau has been in office, the Canadian government has voted against no less than 16 resolutions at the United Nations that were critical of Israel. And one of them, for example, it was adopted by the General Assembly in late 2015, simply reaffirmed the Palestinian people's right to self-determination and to have an independent state. And so, as I say, to vote against 16 of these, and the country was only joined by the United States, Israel, and 4 tiny island states in opposing the December 2015 self-determination resolution. 177 states voted for that resolution. The UN Security Council at the end of 2016 adopted a resolution calling Israel's settlements a flagrant violation of international law and a serious obstacle to peace. 14-0 was the vote on the Security Council. The US government abstained. For weeks on end, the Trudeau government remained very quiet about this, said nothing. And finally, its hand was forced a few days ago when the Israeli Knesset adopted something called the Settlement Regulation Law, which purports to legalize settlements that are almost universally recognized to be a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And at that point, very quietly, the Trudeau government issued a statement to the effect that this was not helpful. That was as far as it was prepared to go. And I think only because it had to say something, the Knesset legislation was so draconian and so contrary to international law. The other thing about Canada, we're one of the few countries in the world, relatively few, that have not recognized the state of Palestine. Over 75% of the states in this world, representing the vast majority of the human population, recognize the state of Palestine. So the government, at the base of the Liberal Party, clearly, this is what the survey demonstrates, is predominantly has a negative view of the Israeli government, and you have a political elite within the Liberal Party that is not prepared to do anything, evidently, to ensure the respect for Palestinian rights by the Israeli government, and will support the Israeli government almost no matter what it does. There's a real disconnect here, and I think that disconnect is going to grow over time as the public in Canada comes to understand better and better what is actually being done. And it raises real sort of troubling questions about democratic legitimacy and whether we really have a government in our country that is responsive to the needs and desires of the population, even its own party members and supporters. And it says something about the strength of the Israel lobby in this country. It's very well financed, it's very well organized, and has a degree of influence that is not proportionate to the level of support that the Israeli government enjoys amongst the Canadian population. I think that's quite clear.
Indeed. We've been speaking with Dimitri Lascaris and Earl Washburn. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back with part 2 of our discussion about the findings of a recent survey asking Canadians their opinions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It appears from the results of this study, or this poll rather, that Canadians' opinions or Canadians' feelings towards this conflict in the Middle East is not necessarily in step with the party in power and their policies towards Israel and Palestine. So we're going to come back with part 2. You're watching the Real News Network.